Okay, guys, so we are going to start working on the respiratory system. So here is a picture of the respiratory system and all the organs that are involved. So the nose, and the mouth, because we do breathe in oxygen from the nose or the mouth, so you could consider really either organ, but you can mainly use your nose. The pharynx, which is what we consider the back of the throat. And then right here, the pharynx connects into the trachea. Now, in your throat, we know we have the esophagus, which is what food goes down. Well, this epiglottis right here, it's a flap that stops food from going down into your trachea. So right here where the epiglottis is, that's where your food and your food tube, your esophagus, and your pharynx separate. So in the trachea is what goes into the respiratory system. The trachea then breaks into two branches called the bronchus, which then get even thinner, breaking into the two lungs. You have your left lung and your right lung. Actually, this would be your left lung and this would be your right lung. And as the bronchus break down even smaller, they go into little bitty tiny sacs called the alveoli. But again, those are just part of the lungs. So your larynx is your voice box. If you put your hand over your throat while you talk or hum, you can feel it vibrate. So we use the air that we breathe in as it passes through our larynx, it vibrates, and that's what allows us to talk. So the main organs you need to know is your nose, pharynx, trachea, larynx, lungs, and your bronchus. So what is the function of the respiratory system? Its main function is to move oxygen from the outside environment into our body. And that's really it. We know now after going over the circulatory system that the circulatory system is the one that does the transporting. It's the respiratory system that brings it in. So these two systems rely very heavily on each other. The respiratory system brings it in, and then the circulatory system transports it throughout the entire body. It also helps to remove carbon dioxide and water from the body. So every time we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen, and every time we breathe out carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so here's a picture of your lungs, okay? Your lungs are some very soft tissue that is actually surrounded by a fluid, which is called your pleural fluid. Here's a picture showing you the pulmonary artery. Now remember, the pulmonary artery is the artery that connects the heart from the right side. So all the oxygen poor blood is going to go in the pulmonary artery to the lungs, where it then picks up oxygen-rich blood to go back to the heart to pump to the rest of the body. So why do we breathe? The respiratory system is a process in which oxygen and glucose undergo a complex series of chemical reactions inside the cells. The chemical reactions release the energy that fuels growth and other cell processes. So what does that mean? Pretty much for our cells to survive, they have to have oxygen and glucose. Glucose is the energy that we use. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct, a waste that is made when our cells burn glucose. And it's toxic to our bodies. So our body has to also have a way of getting rid of it. Because we are so thick, meaning that we're made up of trillions and trillions of cells, not every cell can absorb oxygen on its own, so we have to have a complex system to develop with our complex bodies. So as air travels from the outside environment into the lungs, it passes through the following organs: the nose, the pharynx, into the trachea, where it splits and goes into the bronchi, or the bronchus, which is the right or left. The structure of these organs enable them to warm and moisten air and to remove any harmful materials. Now you know that your nose is going to be your first line of defense. That's why we have hairs in our nose. As we're breathing in dust and pollen and all these particles, the hairs in our nose are made to filter and trap a lot of them. Then it goes into the pharynx and the trachea. They are all aligned to have mucus and be warm and moist to help stop any harmful thing from actually entering into the lung tissue where it can become severe. So here's the respiratory system. Don't worry about too many of the words. So as the air goes into the nose, it goes down into the pharynx, where it passes through the epiglottis flap into the trachea. Now, this is when I talked about the digestive system. If you swallow some food sometimes, your body automatically starts coughing to get that food out of the trachea where it doesn't belong, because again, that's very harmful and we don't want it in our lungs. Once it goes into the trachea, it will then split into the bronchus, right or left lung, which then will kind of branch smaller and smaller, all the way till it ends into these little sacs called alveoli, or alveolus if it's plural. This is where the cardiovascular system comes in. The oxygen is picked up. These are the capillaries of the lungs. Very thin, very numerous to increase surface area to allow more gas exchange to occur. So it is at the alveoli where gas exchange occurs. This is where all the blood of our arteries picks up the oxygen to go back to the heart to pump it to every cell in our body. Also, I do need to bring in, we'll go there later, the nose. As air enters through the nose and the nostrils, we talked about the nose cavity. Here it is warmed by our blood, and the nasal cavity also contains mucus, which to help to trap the dust and the bacteria, which is what turns into boogers. So whenever you have boogers, it's just you were breathing a lot of dirty air. Cilia, which are the tiny little hair-like extensions, can move together whip-like to move the mucus into the throat. And you should have all kind of noticed that in that Osmosis Jones video. The pharynx, as air enters the pharynx after passing through the nasal cavity. The pharynx is also known as your throat. It is the only part of the respiratory system that is shared with the digestive system. So that once you get past that epiglottis flap, it's where the esophagus and the trachea split. The trachea. From the trachea, air moves into the trachea, which is known as our windpipe. It is lined with cilia and mucus, again to help the air to warm up and to trap any dirt. The cilia sweeps upwards to the pharynx where it is swallowed. This helps to clean and moisten the air. So here's a picture of somebody's trachea. See how you can see the split? So the anatomy of the lungs. Here's a better picture. So as we go from the trachea into the bronchi, which is the white, it leads into these like little sacs that kind of almost look like grapes, a tiny bunch of tiny little balls all together like grapes. These are called the alveoli. At the alveoli, this is where the cardiovascular system, right, that pulmonary artery comes in and picks up the oxygen. So notice how it goes from oxygen poor at blue to oxygen rich at red. Then all those capillaries turn back into an artery where it enters back into the heart to go to the rest of the body. Air moves from the trachea into the bronchi, and the bronchi are passages that branch from the trachea and direct air into the lungs. The lungs are the main organ for the respiratory system. Inside the lungs, the bronchi continue to branch into smaller and smaller tubes until it reaches the alveoli, this grape-like structure at the end of the small tubes. This is where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. So write this down, put a big star around it, put a bubble cloud. You need to know that. The alveoli is where gas exchange occurs. It's also surrounded by the capillaries that carry the oxygen-poor blood, turning it into oxygen-rich blood. And the carbon dioxide also gets in, and the water passes from the blood into the alveoli. So as the oxygen enters the bloodstream, the carbon dioxide leaves the bloodstream, and then it gathers together, following the same path that it came in, but going out, and that's what you exhale. So every time you breathe in, and you feel your chest rising, that's because air is filling up all those tiny sacs, and oxygen is hopping into your blood, and carbon dioxide is hopping out of your blood. And then as your chest falls and you breathe out the carbon dioxide. And every time you breathe, this happens. So, like we said, where gas exchange happens is all right here. Okay? Oxygen enters, carbon dioxide leaves. So, how to breathe, in case you forgot. The lungs are surrounded by ribs, which have a muscle attached. This very important muscle is at the base of your lungs, and it is called your diaphragm. It's this bell-shaped muscle. So just like the heart is the muscle behind the cardiovascular system, the diaphragm is the muscle behind the respiratory system. Every time you breathe in, the rib muscles contract, lifting the chest wall up and out. This makes a larger volume, causing negative pressure in our lungs, making air rush in. When the diaphragm relaxes, it actually moves up. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. When the diaphragm expands, the result is the air pressure inside the lungs is less, therefore the air pours into the body, and this is called inhalation. So what happens when you breathe out? It's the exact opposite. The diaphragm muscles relax, causing the chest cavity to move in and up. This decreases the volume of the lungs, squeezing and pushing the air out. So it's kind of like when you blow into a balloon. As you blow in, you're increasing the pressure, and so it expands. If you were to take that balloon after it has air into it and squeeze it and decrease the volume, all the air would come rushing out. And this is exhalation. So here's a picture showing you. Notice how the muscles will contract, and it will actually, the diaphragm is very, very low. It comes down. Notice how it's below the sternum, where when you breathe out, it's above it. So because the volume is bigger, air gets pushed in, and when you breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes, causing air to get pushed out. So if you need to go ahead and pause the video and draw this picture in your notes. So how do we speak? The larynx, or the voice box, is located at the top of your trachea under your epiglottis. You have two vocal cords that stretch across an opening of the larynx. Air from the lungs rushes over them, causing them to vibrate, which creates your voice. When the cords are shortened, they produce a higher voice, and when they become longer, they produce a lower voice. During puberty, which many of you are going through right now, the vocal cords of males become longer because you get taller, producing a deeper voice. So let's talk about smoking. Chemicals such as tar, carbon monoxide, and nicotine are almost deadly. The chemicals can cause chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and lung cancer. These are some very common and very dangerous diseases that are associated with smoking. So every time you smoke, all this tar and nasty, there's like over 1,000 chemicals in a cigarette, are going to line in all the very sensitive tissues of your lungs where they're going to stay. And this helps to increase the spread of cancer. Okay, so that's where we're going to end. If you need to rewind this, go ahead and do so, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.